Hello friends, today we are discussing Aristotle's literary criticism. Aristotle was born in 384 BC at Stagirus. His father Nicomachus was court physician to the Macedonian king, and from this began Aristotle's long association with the Macedonian court, which considerably influenced his life. At the age of 17, he was sent to Athens, the intellectual center of the world, to complete his education. He joined the academy and studied under Plato, attending his lectures for a period of 20 years. In the later years of his association with Plato and the academy, he began to lecture on his own account, especially on the subject of rhetoric. At the death of Plato in 347, the preeminent ability of Aristotle would seem to have designated him to succeed to the leadership of the academy. But his divergence from Plato's teachings was too great to make this possible, and Plato's nephew was chosen instead. Later, he became the tutor of 13-year-old Alexander, later known as Alexander the Great. When Alexander succeeded to the kingship, Aristotle returned to Athens, which he had not visited since the death of Plato. He found the Platonic school flourishing under Xenocrates and Platonism the dominant philosophy of Athens. He thus set up his own school at a place called the Lyceum. When teaching at the Lyceum, Aristotle had a habit of walking about as he discoursed. It was in connection with this that his followers became known in later years as the Peripatetics, meaning to walk about. He is said to have given two kinds of lectures: the more detailed discussions in the morning for an inner circle of advanced students, and the popular discourses in the evening for the general body of lovers of knowledge. At the sudden death of Alexander in 323 BC, the pro-Macedonian government in Athens was overthrown, and a general reaction occurred against anything Macedonian. To escape prosecution, Aristotle fled to another city, Chalcis, so that, as Aristotle himself said, the Athenians might not have another opportunity of sinning against philosophy as they had already done in the person of Socrates. In the first year of his residence at Chalcis in 322 BC, he died of a stomach illness. Aristotle is the first scientific critic, and his literary criticism is largely embodied in the Poetics. The Poetics is a short treatise of 26 chapters, neither comprehensive nor exhaustive. The Poetics falls into 6 parts. First part, chapters 1 to 5, deal with the introductory remarks on poetry, classification of poetry into different kinds. Chapters 6 to 19 deal with discussion of tragedy. Chapters 20 to 22 deal with the discussion of poetic diction, style, vocabulary, etc. Chapter 23 deals with the discussion of narrative poetry and tragedy. Chapters 24 and 26 deal with the discussion of epic and comparison with tragedy. Chapter 25 deals with objections of critics against poetry and Aristotle's reply. Defects of the Poetics. The Poetics is not a coherent treatise of the subject and has some defects. First one, disproportionate handling of the subject. Then, lyric poetry has been ignored. Descriptive poetry is not dealt with. Comedy and epic are not elaborated in detail. All aspects of tragedy are not touched upon. Telegraphic and highly concentrated style. Greatness of the Poetics. Despite the defects, the Poetics is an epoch-making work with continuous and universal significance. Aristotle discards the earlier oracular method, according to which critical pronouncements were supposed to be the result of prophetic insight, as well as Plato's dialectic method, use of dialogue or discussion. Aristotle starts from concrete facts or existing Greek poetry and undertakes a genuine exploration in search of truth. Aristotle studies poetry in relation to man. Thus, his method is psychological. Aristotle originated the historical method of inquiry and describes the various phases in the history of Greek poetry. Plato was the first to use the term mimesis in connection with poetry, but Aristotle gave it new and definite meaning. In Aristotelian theory, poetic imitation is not mere mimicry or an act of servile copying, but an act of imaginative recreation whereby the poet, drawing his material from the phenomenal world, makes something new out of it. In Aristotle's view, imitation is a common basis of all fine arts. While Plato equated poetry with painting, Aristotle equated it with music, not a servile representation of the surface, but a reproduction of the higher reality within, of the passions or emotions of men. The painter imitates through form and color, while the poet through language, rhythm, and harmony. The musician also imitates through rhythm and harmony. Hence, poetry is closer to music than painting. He also pointed out that different kinds of poetry differ from one another in their manner of imitation. Aristotle said that the objects of poetic imitation are men in action, external or internal action, men as they are and as they ought to be. That is, the poet recreates reality creatively and brings order out of chaos. Poetry in this sense is superior to history. History tells us what has happened, while poetry tells us what may or ought to happen. While history represents the particular, poetry represents the universal. Hence, poetry has a permanent appeal. Poetry in this light can be equated with philosophy. Crucial to Aristotle's defense of art is rejection of Plato's dualism. Man is not an embodied intellect, longing for the spiritual release of death, but rather an animal with, among all faculties, the ability to use reason and to create. Rejection of Plato's rationalism. We must study humans as we could study other animals to discover what their nature is. Look among the species, see who are thriving and successful and in what activities do they engage. For Aristotle, this is how to determine what is and is not appropriate for a human and human societies. Rejection that mimesis is mere mirroring of nature. Aristotle's vindication of poetry includes arguments like art is not useless, it is natural. The reasons he provided are it is natural for human beings to imitate. Any human society which is healthy will be a society where there is imitative art. Nothing is more natural than for children to pretend. Art production and training is a necessary part of any education since it uses and encourages the imaginative manipulation of ideas. Nothing is more natural than for human beings to create using their imagination. Since art is imitation, it is an imaginative use of concepts. At its heart, art is conceptual, intellectual. Aristotle also emphasized that good art is not dangerous or deceptive because artists must accurately portray reality to be successful. For example, drama must accurately portray psychological reality in order for characters to be believable and their actions understandable. Art teaches effectively and it teaches the truth. Convincing and powerful drama is convincing and powerful because it reveals some truth of human nature. Aristotle argued that sensuous art is not a bad thing. Aristotle did not believe that the mind was one thing and the body was something else, and therefore Aristotle did not have the bias against physical pleasure that Plato did. The only way of acquiring knowledge at all, according to Aristotle, was through the senses, and so developing, exercising and sharpening those senses through art was healthy. Art was not solely concerned with the sensual pleasures, but rather was or should be an intellectual, conceptual affair. Aristotle affirmed that good art is tied to morality and truth. Successful tragic drama always teaches morality. When trying to understand how tragedies achieve the peculiar effect or pathos, he notes the psychology and morality of people. Aristotle agreed that art did stir up negative emotions, but he claims it then pushed these in a harmless, healthy way, which means the doctrine of catharsis. Art is neither psychologically destabilizing nor politically destructive. Art is a therapeutic part of the healthy life of not only the individual but of the nation.